Right.
Hello, I'm Russell. For the avoidance of all doubt, I'm Russell, this is John.
I'm John, yes. Can I just get my quote out of the way? I've got two, but I'll do one now. There's no success like failure, and failure is no success at all. I've always loved that line from Bob Dylan. I was thinking that one of the successes so far of the evening is the success of the quote, I would posit here. So Russell, I think if we start with just sort of unpick some of the, or one or two of the issues that cropped up in the conference for the love of it, and it's been touched upon in a couple of the presentations, that it's really about how we measure the measurement of success. You know, for we've heard how it's measured for the institution, and latterly for the tendency to measure success in terms of artists, in terms of income and income generation, and I think there's a lot of sort of CPT opportunities that are actually given to artists or offered to artists by organisations and individuals that really think about or focus on ways of earning money that is very much centred on their studio practice as being the only source of income for an artist. I think artists can and should have other, or think about other sources of income that aren't only about their art practice. And this is what I'm just going to, before you respond, I just put in my other quote now. This is a Philip Larkin quote. It's my only other one, and this is Philip Larkin, who's a librarian at Hull University, and he's talking about his job. He says that work is a kind of vacuum, an emptiness where I just switch off everything except the scant intelligence necessary to keep me going. So,
I think in terms of the conference, what came across for me was that people have very individual notions of what success means, which doesn't come as a huge surprise. It was one artist suggested that to be successful as an artist means that you should get a job, and therefore you don't need to worry about making money. You can just have a job and make your work kind of on the side. There's some research that we're looking at doing later this year, part of which we're seeing if there's a way that we could come up with a business model that an artist, funders and government and everyone is very keen on thinking of artists as being small businesses, which is a really weird idea for me. But assuming that artists are small businesses, what is their business model? What is the business model of a business that makes money doing something which isn't its core business to support what its core business is that doesn't make any money? That's like no business in the world, really. Yeah, in terms of success, it does seem to be quite an individual thing. It's when we've asked artists anecdotally, success seems to be more around things like being part of a critical conversation, having an exhibition, keeping the motivation going to keep making work, showing it to and talking about it with other artists, and money comes quite far down on the list.
Yeah, I think that's a good sort of point to really move the conversation on away from money. Because one question that the question that prompts me is this thing: do artists actually need money? And I think, as was indicated right at the end of the last presentation, I think the other things that happen around an art practice, like a critical engagement, a critical discourse, I think those are areas of support that organisations should think of or could think of in offering in a much more sort of positive and proactive way, rather than just this focus on. Over the years, I've been to a few CPD presentations, and they all, without fail, use a business model, of a business. You write your business plan, etc., which it's not applicable to an art practice. An art practice is a failing business. It just should
It's a really
should
nice way of
stop.
thinking about it, actually.
Well, I think to be pragmatic, and I think I see this. What I do is a failing business, and even Beacon in turn, if it was looked at as a business, it is a failing business because it's struggling, to get money. It doesn't. It just about ticks over, but it's not. That's not. What artists do is make art, and artists will always make art. So
Yes, that's true. But within that, there's then a huge scope for exploitation of artists, because artists will always make art. If I'm a gallery or a commissioner or whoever who wants some art activity to take place, but I don't really want to pay artists, I'll always be able to find an artist who will do it. That doesn't make it right. The fact that it can operate doesn't mean that it's ethically or morally the right way for that system to operate. The problem really is, as someone pointed out to me the other day, the problem really is about supply and demand. There's a huge supply of artists, and there's a tiny demand. There's as was in the previous presentation about the curators and essentially the gatekeepers of how artists are presented or shown or exhibited or sold. There's very few of them for a very small market. I think that market could, and when I say market, I don't necessarily mean a sales market, but a kind of marketplace of viewing or experience or whatever it might be. I think that could be bigger, but I think it's in a lot of people's vested interest to keep it quite small. And I think some of the vested interest comes from artists as well, who want to keep a kind of special feeling around their work, which is totally understandable. So there's a lot of crosswise tensions pulling in lots of different directions. I don't think that answers your question at all, or even addressed your question.
Well, it does to some extent. I think I just wonder if we sort of follow on to that. I wonder if we think about the role of education or certainly HE institutions in the way that the artists are actually brought into being, if you like. I just wonder whether there's some blame, is a good word, perhaps, in terms of expectations or how artists are trained in the UK, and actually whether you need to actually go to actually go to an educational institution now because it seems like the sort of the institutionalisation of being an artist to some extent has come out of the sort of commercialisation of the education system in this country.
The education system is responsible for many things. Even so, I'm told by artists who are older than me that 20, 30, 40 years ago, you wouldn't really call yourself an artist. You might call yourself a painter or a sculptor or whatever. You wouldn't call yourself an artist as this kind of broad brush thing, which I think HE has and continues to encourage. I think HE also, and I think this is also across art forms, from speaking to colleagues who work with different art forms, that it's kind of set up that the only way to be an artist is to have a studio and have exhibitions. That's kind of it. That's the sort of gold standard. And as we all know, I'm sure if you have a straw poll in this room, there's as many different ways to be an artist as there are artists. There are as many different personal circumstances and motivations and drives and needing to or wanting to exhibit at particular times in particular ways. It's completely variable. And higher education, I think, does play a part in squashing that into fit one mould of being an artist, which it can take graduates 3, 4, 5 years to unlearn after they graduate that actually, this stuff I was doing at home while I was doing this important stuff at art school, I was doing this stuff at home, and that's actually stuff I'm interested in and the stuff that's going to keep me going. And it takes a while to kind of unlearn some of that stuff.
I think what I've always felt that, and I feel and I believe that artists are very good entrepreneurs. I mean, artists have that entrepreneurial spirit, and artists can get together. They form groups, they form communities in wherever, and things happen, things come out of it. So I think certainly the way artists can populate certainly urban properties, and actually increase property values. And so I think the artists are actually very good at doing things. I often wonder why the institution needs to intervene to offer them something which they think, the institution thinks artists need, which I was saying earlier, invariably means using a standard business model without actually thinking about, or even really speaking to, actually asking artists what they need. I think artists' needs are different to how an institution might perceive them. Certainly, any research or initiatives that come out of educational institutions, because they have their own agenda, which is not necessarily artistic.
I mean, I think there's a language issue. I think artists are entrepreneurial in that they will move mountains to make the thing happen that they want to happen, which often involves them not paying themselves, or paying themselves a really tiny amount of money for a huge amount of work. I think that's a drive that comes from having an idea, having a practice, having an ongoing line of research, and wanting to get that out there. So I think, and then that can be labelled entrepreneurial or a small business or whatever. But I think that the language now has a tendency to mask what the real motivations of artists are. While for some artists it might be money, and as I say, there's as many different artists as there are kinds of artists, so there will definitely be artists out there who are motivated by money. I suspect it's not very many, but I'm more than happy to be corrected about that. But I think everything has been, because of the way the funding system works, we have a very patriarchal funding system, so the patronising funding system as well, which comes from government directives and which all at the moment at least tend to be around money. So that is everything has to be valued in financial terms rather than in intrinsic or cultural or communal or community terms. You have to find a way of translating what you're doing into money, which is where this language comes in.
Well, I wonder
that down to that.
I wonder whether we actually need to do that. Shouldn't we actually be thinking about other ways, other forms of language to use that can actually, because we are talking about quantifying. It's about quantifying notions of success or measuring. Sort of measuring, and I think I said earlier, there's the personal, the way we measure our own success, and there's the way the institution will measure success. So I think that way of thinking, it sort of steps outside. It's moving away from the individual and becoming perhaps a bit too corporate.
It becomes standardised. I mean, and that definitely starts in higher education, because in order to get a degree with a mark, there has to be a standard to which you could be judged to be given a mark or a grade, and that actually has to be a national standard. So that's sort of where it starts. Is this? There's all these individual practices going on, and the only way that they can be judged academically is through a wider standardization process. And I think a lot of artists tend to internalize that, and that becomes then how they may judge their success in their later practice by applying some other kind of standard. It might be how many exhibitions you've had compared to one of your peers, or how happy you are with your work compared to someone else, or how cheap the studio is, or whatever it might be. Rather than a kind of self-sustaining, slightly more idealistic or even poetical view of what your practice is. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer for everyone, and I think everyone has to be comfortable with whatever it is they're working.
No, absolutely, and there are different communities of artists, different types of of art practice. And there certainly are a lot of artists that make make a living from making art and selling work, which again is covers the whole sort of range of different types of of genres.
But equally, I have met artists who have said that they really value having a job outside of the art world, outside of their practice and outside of the art world, as a way of coming up with new ideas or meeting different people or just getting out of their head for a while. There's very few artists that I've met who would be happy sitting in their studio all day, every day, in their own heads, trying to work out the next piece of work, because it's got to be nourished by something else. And, pragmatically, that something else might as well be something you're earning money at as well.
No, absolutely. But how do you, in terms of the research you mentioned, or the proposed research, how do you intend to sort of measure or capture what artists think? How are you going to understand how artists feel about the way
we're still working on the methodology, so I'm not sure if I could really answer that right now. But the purpose of it, in terms of how artists feel about the way that they earn money, I think is an important one, because exactly as you said, a lot of professional development opportunities for artists are entirely around money and paying artists for being artists, which in some cases, absolutely. But I think there's also cases where artists are equally happy to get something else out of it, which besides, or perhaps as well as, a bit of money. And it's only once we can find out what those different things are that we as organisations can start to provide the things that artists actually need.
Yeah, and I think that thing about giving one's services, for we're not being paid for doing certain things. From my point of view, it's all it's like doing a quick risk assessment. This is to use a business analogy, because it's really thinking about what could the possible payoff be for perhaps going to a meeting or me doing this, for example, this evening. It's you make that. You need to make a sort of quick sort of mental risk assessment. I think it's something that is probably peculiar to the art world, certainly to artists. That artists do this a lot. They take risks in all sorts of ways. One of which is to give over their services for nothing, basically. A lot of the times, and this is something I feel that institutions, although there might be a cursory acknowledgement of this, there's not a real sort of measurable acknowledgement by certainly funding institutions like the Arts Council that artists do a lot of work, a lot of groundwork beforehand. A lot of work sort of goes on, and this is something that's not acknowledged, and there needs to be some sort of work and research around how that can be addressed.
I mean, the one thing that I don't think we keen to take risks on is their reputation. Their reputation and their cultural currency is the main asset that they have, their reputation. So if you can take risks with the money, then you can take risks with the... you don't have to take risks with the reputation. But I mean, it's like, how many artists have been told, oh well, you should do this, even though I'm not paying, you should do it because it's a great opportunity for you. It's like, well, I think I'll be the judge of that, actually. But how many? I hope all artists would stop to think about that. Well, what is the good opportunity here? And to ask people, actually, what is the good opportunity here? What are you offering if you're not offering them?
Yeah, no, I agree, but it's one does need to make
a risk assessment.
You need to assess the risk, and sometimes it is a risk. I think probably most all artists can empathise with that. It'd be quite good to get some feedback from the floor. Can you do that? Any thoughts or anything?
Shall I say that all again?
No, just carry on.
Just basically that in educational terms, we're talking about the assessment process, aren't we? And Sir Ken Robinson has some interesting ideas about the education system in art and whether it makes artists actually think convergently and make assessments about their works, and how that informs their work or how that perhaps stifles their creative development. And that's an ongoing discussion, and I was interested in your ongoing discussion. I don't have any answers, I just wanted to add that comment.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting point, and again, purely anecdotally, I've heard from when speaking to recent graduates, and it was kind of my experience as well, actually, after graduating, that it takes between about 3 to 5 years to unlearn the convergent thought that you've got into at art school. I mean, human beings are pack animals. We like to fit in, which is so there's always going to be a tension between that and being an individual artist and having your own creative practice. So there's definitely a risk with that, I think. And I think I have also heard that professional development programs at art school also run that risk as well, that if you get an artist in to talk about how they are an artist, then you run the risk of a bunch of art students thinking, oh, well, that's how you do it, that's how you be an artist. I think there's also a thing about when artists do talks, they present themselves very successfully, and they talk about they'll have the exhibition and they'll have this residency and everything, and it's all very kind of hermetically sealed in a little bubble of this is the stuff I'm showing you because it makes me look good. I do that too, and but at ArtQuest, when we have artists do talks, we write it into their contracts now that they have to spend at least 5 or 10 minutes at the beginning talking about how they make money, how they earn a living, whether that's I teach or I've got a job doing whatever, or a surprising number of people say I've got a rich partner, or a partner with a job, at least, not necessarily rich, but somewhat rich, in relative terms.
That was good.
Yeah.
How have we moved away from that? Sounds like a model to me. Anybody else like to ask a question or make a comment?
I'm not quite sure how to put this into words. I've been thinking. I wondered if you had any comments on. It seems this is quite specific to artists and not other creative people, because musicians, there are thousands of musicians all over the country who have other jobs and play music for nothing and never expect to make money from it and do it for the love of it. But in art, there's a kind of snobby look down on people who do it that way. There's kind of, why is it so different between visual artists and musicians, when you can just do music for the love of music, but doing art for the love of art and not wanting to make a career out of it is never kind of accepted.
I think there's I think that's I think there's if there is an answer to that, I think it's very complicated, and I don't have it necessarily. But there is, we do work with other with organisations that work in other art forms, including music, with an organisation called Sound Sense in particular that works with community musicians, so musicians who work in community settings and doing the music equivalent of gallery education, I would say. And the short answer to the difference is it just is different. I know that's a very unsatisfying answer, but different art forms have different traditions. I think the professionalisation of artists over the last maybe 15 to 20 years has come out of things like the funding system, the education system, an increasing willingness amongst visual artists to consider themselves as professional on the one hand, and with that comes a desire to be paid for your work. If you're a professional, one thing that separates a professional from an amateur, with big quote marks around both of those words, is being paid. The thing that always strikes me as quite hilarious, really, is that most artists still aren't paid for most of the stuff that they do, but they still call themselves professional artists as a kind of as a badge, as a way of describing themselves that's kind of reflexive about how seriously they take their own practice and their own careers. So it's interesting that from the outside that comes across as snobbishness. From the inside of the art world, I don't experience it in that way, but it's an interesting point.
Yeah, I work inside the art world as well. I suppose in terms of success, I've always found a dichotomy between kind of what an artist thinks is successful and actually people who play music or act, do amateur dramatics and stuff, just getting personal enjoyment, and that is seen as success. Whereas for some reason art, that isn't seen as success.
But there are a lot of artists who just do it for the love of it and do it for themselves and their friends and family. And I guess that's just not the people who are sitting in this room just now, really.
Not get paid for it. I think both the love and the payment can sit well, because as an artist I don't live on fresh air, and I don't couch surf as a student or a new graduate. I have real responsibilities in the world, and in terms, I've always done other kinds of work related to my art practice, but it's quite difficult for artists actually to be fully open to the trajectory of their careers and the opportunities that are presented if they're nailed to a stable job. So it's, how do you take off for a 6-month residency? How do you take an opportunity that happens on your main work day? You know, so there's got to be some juggling as well, even in kinds of work that artists can take or are willing to do, or how they find that either compromise or that pathway through. But I think we shouldn't pit about earning a living against the love of what we do, because we need both.
Well, that is a huge justification that people give for not paying artists. It's like, well, you would do it anyway. It goes back to what we talked about at the beginning of this conversation. You would do it anyway, so given that you would do it anyway, I don't need to take any particular care of you or pay you any money, and that's just ethically and morally, that's just wrong, as well as probably illegal. But there's also, given that artists do rely on their reputation, there's a lot of artists I've met who don't want to put their head above the parapet and don't want to rock the boat because they're afraid that the work won't keep coming, even though the money doesn't even start coming.
But I also think there is a false expectation on the part of artists that they expect to be paid. I think we have to think about ideas of quality, for example, and criticality. You know, the criticality of the work that's being produced. So I think it is a false expectation that just because I'm an artist, I must get paid. I don't think it's as easy.
I think yes, it does actually. I think a lot of curators also don't get paid. Curators who work in a building like this, of course, do. But curating's an odd one. I mean, when I first became an artist and was doing unpaid internships, there weren't any curators. There were exhibition organisers, and then calling themselves curators sort of raised the status and therefore perhaps along the way the salary as well. But independent curators, who are sometimes often artists as well, also probably aren't getting paid.
I think fairly strong feelings about it, not coming from a middle class background where I have to earn my living, but I'm worthy of being paid for the work that I produce, if it's of a critical standard, if it's taking place in a publicly funded institution, and I don't see it. I do things sometimes in response to a generosity of invitation, but I don't do it very frequently because I think it's not a good example. I don't think it's a good example for artists to view themselves as emergent for 10 years and to build their CV free for 10 years. I don't think it's a good example for artists on the whole to work for nothing and to keep that precedent going. And I think people, when they go through art school, they have to start identifying, not that they should make art for money, but they should have some kind of way of picking their way through a path that at least can pay their bills sometimes, you know, and not sink further and further into debt all the time. So I just think, I don't think the artist is special in that way of earning their living through art, but I think it's not unreasonable to sit alongside technicians and cleaning staff and curators and directors and educators. After all, you know, we're all building culture together.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and artists are often, all those roles that you named are often also artists who are cross-subsidising their freelance practice in those ways.
I think that's part of the sort of networks that artists operate, because there's lots of different systems that go on. You know, there is a lot of exchange, you know, there's a lot of knowledge exchange, you know, name exchange, you know, sharing of things, and it's just part of the sort of way that artists operate. I think it comes back to, you know, to my point about, you know, artists as the entrepreneur, because we're able to do that. Artists can get together and make things happen. I think it's when the institution gets involved, it starts to get a bit complicated.
Can I make a simple point, really, which is that artists aren't professionalised. The reason they don't get paid is they're not organised. There isn't a profession of artists that controls the supply and demand for artists, and it's very difficult to imagine how that could be the case. And this used to be the case, you know, the Middle Ages, and up until the sort of 17th, 18th century, it still survives a little bit in things like National Royal Society of Portrait Painters and Sculpture Painters. They're almost like guilds. But you know, it's very difficult. You know, there's a price you pay for being a modern artist.
Exactly.
And one of it is that artists are like organising cats. You know, it's just not going to happen. And they're a bunch of scabs.
Well, this is it. I mean, it comes down to solidarity. As long as one artist is willing to work for nothing, then it doesn't work. And there will always be one artist, at least one artist, who is willing to work for nothing. There is, of course, the Scottish Artists Union, which have a kind of, it's not a selection criteria, they have a list of 6 things, and if you match, I think 2 or maybe 3 of them, then you can be accepted into their membership. But yeah, as soon as you say this is an artist, this is our definition of an artist, you need to get 75% of artists standing up saying, well, that's not me, I don't belong in your group, I'm much too independent to belong with that. It's like herding cats. So the solidarity is the problem, and the definition is the problem. Yeah.
I think one of the challenges with focusing on funding or money as part of our success is who ought to pay us as artists. With art where it is today, so many of us have moved away from creating commercial work to creating experiential work. So if we ought to get paid, then who do we think ought to pay us? If we're dependent on government being that, then we're at political wings. So I think there has to be a level of us understanding that if we want the freedom to make the work we want to make, then maybe there is no funding, there's no monetary gains around that. So I do think it's what you were mentioning earlier about looking at what we state successful as, which currently, with the pyramid of art, with the most well-known artists being at the top, it is still moved and changed and by financial gains. There is definitely a conversation to have about how we equate the success, because unless we're willing to all turn back into commercial artists and painters and making sure that we're painting portraits of people's walls, which of course there's nothing wrong with doing that, but the majority of artists I think are moving away from that. And unless we want to go back to there, then we are the result of funders and working rubber gains.
Definitely, absolutely, and then not only is that what's financially supporting your practice, but they also become your audience. Your audience becomes the funders.
Absolutely, unless we want to charge £1 for a person that walks into the gallery space at least, which of course turns tons of people away who are paying to walk into the spaces. There isn't currently a solution to that.
There's an interesting, there was a report done 8-9-ish years ago called Taste Buds. It was commissioned by the Arts Council, some of you might have heard of it. And really interesting statistic in this report. It was about the commercial potential of the commercial sector, art sector. And it found that something like, I can't remember the exact number, but it was around 60% of people surveyed would really like to buy contemporary art, but they don't know how to. And they don't know if what they're buying is worth the money that they're paying for.
And that's the challenge. If it's affordable to the everyday
it's
person, they tend to assume it's not of value, because we still put financial value on work. So if I can afford it, then it can't be any good. Is what a lot of people think about work.
But there's also that, yes, I like it, and yes, I can afford it, but is it worth £200? It's just a canvas with one colour on it. I quite like it, and I can afford it, but is it really worth £200? Couldn't I have just done that myself? What's the point? Why would I spend that money? And that's the disconnect as well. So even amongst people, contemporary artists who do make work which could be sold, there's a huge potential market out there which isn't able to be tapped, because there's a disconnect between people who might want to buy stuff and the artist in terms of the language, in terms of the value, how things are valued.
We're still valuing it on financial terms, and I think we need to be in some ways clever about valuing our work on cultural terms. But the trouble is, once we get into that, as we already are, and getting further into that, that becomes under political whims, because then we decide that we ought to and get paid by the government or the powers that be, and then we're at their whims instead.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So because you're worth it.
I mean, I've heard of some artists who have their own kind of quite experimental contemporary practice, but also they put work into things like their Folklore Art Fair under a different name, and do the kind of kittens peeking out the top of boots paintings to sell, and be totally fine with that. And I think, why not? Great. We've all got to pay the bills and everything else, so do it in a way that we're comfortable doing it, basically.
One more final comment or question, and then we'll do it to close.
I'll be very quick then. Well, actually, I had when I was at St Martin's, I did part of my placement over in Canada. One of the colleges there, Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, is twinned with St Martin's. And what was very clear, if you know the North American system in terms of certain academic standards, they don't have, for example, A levels, so they have to have what's known as a qualifying year. Now, it's interesting, we haven't in this country yet, although it might change. Anyway, the thing is that the young artists there in the Q year, qualifying year, they'll be equivalent to A level, right, are encouraged to go about what they're doing in a very professional manner, and they invite the press, TV, the Dean of Art comes to their show. They have the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design coming along to actually film them at it.
and they're given a different attitude right from the start. Maybe a North American thing, I'm not sure. So they build up their confidence with this. It just so happens that Nova Scotia, artists are coming out the woodwork. I mean, you could actually get your house done and just swap pictures for decorating stuff. Coming back to St. Martin's, I mentioned the C word to my tutor. And I said, I know we need to, and I contrasted this. We had about 3 hours at the end of our degree, maybe 2 days, maybe I'm exaggerating, to actually, now you're artists, we're going to go out into the world, right? Contrast the two things. One was just, you're just dumped out there. And part and parcel with the art colleges themselves are implicit in this. They could stand up like other organisations. I'm also trained as a scientist. It's a different take. It's similar to what was happening with their artists over in Canada, and I guess the rest of North America as well. So that's one thing. Okay, so in terms of actually building confidence and expecting things, and people respond. And the other thing, De Montfort University, one of my colleagues was told by the tutor that she could sell her drawing for about £800. It's a wonderful drawing, a pencil. And I said, the thing is, if someone offers you £80 for this, take it. Because they're not going to get that £800. She left half her work when she went back overseas. What was the point? You all ran it by residents. So there are three different stories there, and somehow there's the truth in all of
Well, it's not really a question, it's a comment. And that is, if we each take, if we think success is important to ourselves, then we need to take our own responsibility for making sure that we are a success and that we decide what those measures of success are and achieve it if that's what we want. But the other thing is, how just is success satisfying? Because I think that many people achieve things which in other people's eyes are successful, but is that actually satisfying? So many high achievers who would be sort of claimed as being successful actually aren't. It's never enough. You always want to be more successful, the most successful person ever, or the most successful artist. So it's just an observation.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting point, and I think the tension between success and risk, I think, is really interesting. Artistic practice, certainly speaking personally, the riskiness is the exciting bit, and I always remember about Gary Hume. Remember when Gary Hume, when he first started out, he was doing those hospital door paintings? It was just big rectangles with little circles in it. And he just churned them out. And he had a gallery that was selling them for tens of thousands of pounds. And after a few years of it, he basically just stopped painting for about a year. I think he went to New York and just decided, that's it, I'm never going to be an artist again. Because he was so sick of it. He was financially successful, but he was so sick of just being forced, essentially, to turn out the same thing over and over again, that he went away and decided not to be an artist. He then obviously came back and started making paintings again, but that, I assume that from the outside, I certainly would have thought, well, he's made it, he's quite successful, but actually he wasn't happy, and there was no risk in his work anymore, and I think that's a salutary thought.
It is indeed, and a good point to conclude on. Thank you very much, John and Russell. When should we expect the research?
Oh, well, we haven't even got funding for it yet, so
right.
we've done some